Uh, Prime Minister Harper, it's such a pleasure having you with us this morning, with this excellent crowd gathered here. A very stimulating discussion has just taken place on some of the most pressing issues. We just had this discussion on the European Union and everything else. But I'll bring this from where you stand as a person, as a politician with huge standing in public life. You've had the longest tenure as the Prime Minister of Canada outside the first Conservative Prime Minister, which was the founder Prime Minister. More importantly, you led the country through a very troublesome time. This was the time of the economic crisis. You negotiated, I think, the maximum number of trade deals from 5 to 50, jumped to 51. Very aggressive, you had your own position on taxation in the country. But above all, I think even the opposition has always respected you for being, and I'm quoting you here, your theme pet statement that politics is about taking principled decisions in a complex and a dangerous world. And that is what politics is all about. It's not about choosing the easiest path. It's about guiding, leading countries. And in this position where we are seeing a world full of populism, that is a world which is often thrown up in these discussions. You have moved on to your new avatar. You've started Harper and Associates. You've not retired from public life that way. You started Harper and Associates, which is a major consultancy organization partnering with Dentons, the biggest law firm in the world today. And you are continuing the work you started as a member of the G7 in a different capacity. So you perhaps are the perfectly right person to talk to us about. How do you see this? You've said it's a dangerous world, it's a complex world. There are different pulls and pressures, both on leadership as well as various other organizations, multilateral organizations, corporations, trade organizations. We'd love to hear your views on this. So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Sanjoy, for that very kind introduction. I just want to say to you and everybody here, I'm really very pleased to be back in India. This is a country that has been undergoing an amazing transformation for many, many years now, and that transformation is really accelerating, but particularly under the dynamic leadership of my friend, Prime Minister Narendra Modi. I also want to thank you, all of you more broadly, for the opportunity to address this impressive array of thought leaders from around the world at this second Raisina Dialogue. And I want to start by congratulating the Observer Research Foundation and the Ministry of External Affairs for putting together what is a world-class geopolitical and geoeconomic forum. Now, Sanjoy, you and others said you wanted me to speak, and you said whatever topic and whatever length of time, which is probably a good thing because as a former politician, you're going to do that anyway. I just hope I live up to any expectations you may have. I am, of course, a former Prime Minister, as Sanjoy said, and my training is as an economist. I always begin that with a warning that I am not an accountant. I was supposed to be an accountant when I was younger. My father was an accountant. Both of my brothers are accountants. And I took a battery of aptitude tests when I was young that said I should be an accountant. But after a few years of trying, I discovered I did not have the charisma necessary to be an accountant. I want to, what I'm going to do today is take up, because I've been given such a free rein here, take up some very general themes, some general trends in the world, in the Western world in particular, and in the United States especially, and the relevance a couple of those things may have for this country, India. So what are the big trends today? I think if you look around the world, the big trend is unmistakable. It is growing political uncertainty, especially in places we used to think of as the most politically stable in the world. Look at 2016, the upset vote in the Brexit referendum. the victory of Donald Trump in the American presidential election, the continuing rise of so-called populist movements across Europe. Take a couple of other countries, Argentina, South Korea, or not Argentina, excuse me, Brazil, South Korea, apparently popular presidents whose support literally vanished overnight and they were removed from office in a matter of a few weeks. All of these things that seem to occur contrary to expectations, to predictions, to all of the experts. In some cases, events that literally come out of nowhere. So what are we to make of all of this? And let me begin that with a quote. I could think no better person to quote on this, to try and figure out all this. Let us quote Mr. Donald Trump. There's one quote that I love: "What the hell is going on?" When I think about what it all means, my mind turns to one particular event in my prime ministership. And that was to a meeting I had in 2008 in Gdansk, Poland, with Lech Walesa. Now, there are lots of young people who are here who I'm sure this name doesn't have the same meaning it does for some of us who are older. The former president of Poland, the founder of the Solidarity labor union, the man whose actions began a process of the decline and collapse of the Soviet Empire, which remains the most monumental series of geopolitical events in my lifetime. I asked President Walesa, when you scaled the fence of the Gdansk shipyard on August 14th, 1980, to begin the uprising, how confident were you of success? Now, the context of this, of course, remember that dissidents in the Soviet Union and the East Bloc had very short lives, as a rule, and disappeared very quickly. Surprisingly, President Walesa said to me that he was very confident. He had very little doubt of success. Why? He gave me 3 reasons. He said, first, Poland was a Western country, always a Western country. The Polish nation, the Poles are nationalists, did not believe in communism. He said even the Polish communists didn't believe in the Soviet and communist system, so it was only a matter of time before it fell. Second, there was something unprecedented that had occurred, the election of a Polish pope who understood these realities, and this gave the anti-communists in Poland a powerful leadership outside of the political system, a national and international leadership that the Soviet and communist systems simply could not silence. Third, and most important, because President Walesa had been involved in earlier unsuccessful uprisings, he said modern technology. He said that as an electrician, he could see that by 1980, there was a growing revolution in communications and information technology, the development of modern computers, personal computers. We are talking here, by the way, long before the internet, the smartphone. He said all of this was creating a reality that the intricate control of the Soviet system would not be able to cope with. And we all know what happened in the next decade to come. As the East Bloc economies decayed, dissident action continued to grow, the Soviet system's willingness to impose order began to waver, the changes accelerated. First, the satellite states in Eastern Europe fell, then the Soviet republics began to break away, and finally, after an unsuccessful counter-coup, even Russia declared its independence. And the Soviet Empire, a superpower dominating a large part of the planet, simply vanished in a few short years with hardly a shot being fired. This was probably is, the most sudden and complete collapse of a major power in human history. It left us with only one superpower and led to the subsequent spread of the Western economic system across the planet, so-called globalization. Now, I guess what I'm really here to tell you, the message I want to deliver, is that as you look at events around the world, it's the following. The forces that destroyed the Soviet Union have not ceased. They have continued and they have accelerated. And they are eroding power throughout the world, including eroding the state power on which the global order is based. Once again, as I say, just look at the changes happening in the past year, the Brexit referendum, Anti-establishment populist movements in the Western world in particular, the election of Donald Trump, a candidate without precedent in American history, a Republican nominee, but really an independent. And now think back to the forces Lech Walesa was talking about, the rejuvenation of nationalism, leadership from outside government structures and established institutions, and most of all, the technological revolution. Let me focus on the last one. In the past 4 decades, we have gone from the mainframe computer. Very few of you probably know I was actually a programmer on a mainframe computer in the 1970s and early 80s. Mainframe computer, we've gone from that to the personal computer, to the internet, which is the computer of computers, to the smartphone. Something that doesn't cost very much, really, affordable even by relatively poor people throughout the planet. What does that mean? What does that device mean? That device means that almost everyone can receive information in vast quantities. Now, in the past, when I was young, we could get information from TV, radio, but through a limited number of channels. Now we have unlimited number of channels, and we can select the information we get. We get not just vast quantities of information, but tailored information. Information tailored to our needs, to our preferences, to our biases. More importantly, unlike radio and TV in the past, we can transmit this information as we see it to other people, and we can therefore network around such information. So we have something going on for the first time in human history. Everyone, virtually everyone, is becoming or potentially becoming politicized, and becoming politicized on their own terms. Never before in human history have the mass of people been potentially politicized in this way. Before, most people, if they mattered politically at all, perhaps only to very narrow local or family circles. But now, wide politicization can develop. It can develop very quickly. It can develop on any geographic or non-geographic basis. It can develop outside of established institutions, outside of established channels. And as it is doing so, it is increasingly, less predictably eroding power, as I said, including state power. Now, this is having very different effects in different parts of the world. The most extreme is in the Islamic world, or more specifically, the Arab world and the lands close to it. In my term as Prime Minister, I watched as from basically the Straits of Gibraltar to the borders of the Indian subcontinent, more and more lands gravitated to, in a sense, an ungoverned spaces, dominated by a political vision of Islam. Now, we can call it a bastardization of Islam, perhaps, but it is a vision nonetheless, and it is one that rejects all existing nation states. It rejects the global order in its entirety. And it is undermining and overthrowing weak, dysfunctional, and corrupt states and replacing them, as I said, with growing amounts of ungoverned space in that part of the world. Or more accurately, replacing them with so-called governments like ISIS or Boko Haram or the Taliban that are little more than gangs with guns and cell phones and internet access. By the way, I just will say this, given the threat that and those kinds of organizations, those kinds of groups represent the state order, it is absurd that any state would encourage or assist such terrorist entities. On the other side, most resistant to the trend are some Asian countries. China is the best example. This is a state, and other states like it, trying to harness modern information and communications technology to get the economic growth that they can produce, but also to try and attempt to control certain aspects of the modern technology, to limit its use for political activity, and also to maintain broad social and cultural norms. So far, in China and some other places, with some success, but we have to ask how long that success can continue as wealth grows and people's demands for greater political rights and individual empowerment grow also. As has been the case in modern Western societies from the 1960s onward. which really leads me to talk to you about what I believe is happening in the Western world. Now, wherever I go last year, you probably felt the same thing. Wherever I went, it seemed to me I got asked two political questions. One was about Brexit, and the other was about Donald Trump. Now, there are some commonalities. There are some big differences, but some commonalities. But the key commonality is the following. This is the most important thing to remember about those two events. Hardly anyone expected either of them to happen. They were condemned by virtually all the commentators, condemned by virtually all the experts, and they happened anyway. Think about that. Maybe think about this. Maybe they happened precisely because they were condemned by all the experts and all the commentators. Does that sound strange? In the era of globalization, I don't think so. In the era of globalization in Western societies in the post-Cold War era, late 1980s forward, if you look at most Western economies, incomes for the middle and working class populations have been stagnant or declining. I would say that Canada under my government was actually an exception to that, which is why we don't have yet a populist movement. But in the developed world, there have been big changes, and mostly negative for ordinary people. Jobs in traditional sectors have been lost by the millions. In the United States, as an example, 40% of all manufacturing jobs have vanished in the last 3 decades. Some trade relationships have become brutally unbalanced. In the case of China-US, it is a 4-to-1 trade flow. Low-skilled migration has accelerated as wages have failed to rise. Social security systems have become more insecure. And so what we are seeing in the West is a major political cleavage emerging. It is not a traditional left-right cleavage. It's not rich-poor. It's not private sector-public sector. It is between, on the one hand, establishment interests, whatever they may be, most governments, major bureaucracies, major business, corporate interests, major media, entertainment interests, who believe, the so-called elite, who believe in open borders, who believe in open migration, who tend to believe in open trade, because we are the people who in our daily lives cross borders. And on the other hand, are people, for lack of a better term, that we are calling populist, people who live within borders, people whose lives are within borders, who live on the ground in the flyover regions, peoples whose concerns, economic concerns, are national or local, not global, not transnational, whose identities are national and cultural, not international or multicultural. Back to what I said about technology. The fact that all these major institutions, established interests, have a consensus on these things is increasingly irrelevant. With modern technology, people who disagree with this consensus, even if no one appears to speak for them, they can get their own information, develop their own views, define their own interests, network with others who feel the same, and ultimately support leadership from outside the system. I believe that this problem is going to get worse for a couple of reasons. One are a series of economic trends and policies being pursued in the West. I won't get into that now. But the other is how we respond to these kinds of concerns and problems. I watched the Brexit dynamic very closely. I watched the dynamic around the American election very closely. And it seemed to me that the approach of people who opposed Brexit or opposed Mr. Trump, their principal approach seemed to be to call supporters of the other side stupid, bigoted, or worse. Now, I don't know about you, I was in politics a long time. My experience has been, regardless of what you may think, calling people stupid and bigoted and telling them that you are more enlightened and intelligent is not a very good way to influence people's opinions. So I think this is going to get worse unless a different tact is taken. But again, what is the insight we should draw from these events, from other movements who shared broad similarities across the world? It's the following. Just because a very wide establishment and expert consensus exists does not mean the public, the wider public, is going to accept that judgment in whole or in part. In fact, it may actually encourage them to reject the judgment. I'm also going to, let me move away from that for a second and just talk about what this means specifically in the case of the United States, and how that may affect people here, because as everybody has said, this is the elephant in the room, excuse me. So we have elected in the United States the most non-establishment presidential candidate in political history. What does it mean? Top line is this: without a doubt, a Trump presidency is a major source for a time to come of global uncertainty. And we also need to admit that when it comes to specifics, we do not have a clear idea of where the new president will head. But we do have some broad outlines, and we have every reason to believe that Donald Trump is serious about those broad directions. And there are two things on international affairs that I believe he is going to do that are truly game changers. First, Donald Trump is going to reverse the cornerstone of 7 decades of American foreign policy. That is, he is going to reject and reverse the idea that the United States has an overarching responsibility for global affairs. Now, why did the Americans vote for that? I think if you look at this honestly, and I grant you most people might not be able to articulate it this way, but I think the American public has been told two things that they are finding increasingly incompatible from their leaders. One is that we are truly in a multipolar world and the United States cannot do it all. But then secondly, that America and America alone must accept overall global responsibility. And I think the public figures out that those two things together are not working for them. And they are choosing, the American public is choosing to accept, in the terms of this conference, a multipolar world. Now, I know many of us, many people here, have wanted this for a long time. I would just caution you, you may not like it as much as you thought you would once it occurs. Trump will, I believe, the U.S. under Trump will focus squarely on America's vital national interests, narrowly defined, especially its economic interests. This does not mean the United States will be unwilling to work with friends and allies on shared interests. It will, but only when such friends and allies are prepared to bring real assets to the table. That, by the way, is going to apply first and foremost to Europe. I'll come to Asia in a second. But let me just say this as well. I know we are all worried about what all this means. I'm trying to look at glass half full here. It is possible for a second, if you think about it, that Trump's approach could actually lead to a much more stable American foreign policy. I had a front row seat for 10 years, up close, watching the United States foreign policy swing back and forth from overreaching global adventures and then to withering self-criticism and retreat. Trump's approach could avoid both the tendency of the U.S. in one era to overestimate its capabilities and in another era to overstate its limitations. So if Trump pursues a more transactional approach, that could be entirely realistic and potentially much more predictable, but we should be under no illusion. This is going to take us into a world we have not known in 8 decades, a world devoid of one or two dominating powers, and the risks of that unknown are significant. I said that was the first big game changer in American foreign policy under Trump. I believe the second is going to be this. Under Donald Trump, the United States will cease to view the rise of China as essentially benign. That has been the approach of American policy to China for 4 decades. It's been a consensus of foreign policy and many corporate interests. The Trump's administration to China extends way beyond the mere trade imbalance. It has to do with a series of issues the belief that that massive trade imbalance is financing the rise of a potential geopolitical adversary, and obviously pointing to issues like cyber warfare, the South China Sea. On this, I would just say once again, I believe that Donald Trump's positions on this, whether we like them or not, are reflective of American public opinion. The American public has long been much more skeptical than the establishment consensus has been around China. It has long viewed China as much more of a threat than an opportunity. Now, I happen to believe that for many in Asia, and for India in particular, these developments are actually an opportunity. As the Trump administration moves away from Europe, as it moves towards Asia, as it confronts China, as it continues to focus on jihadist extremism, it will be looking for friends, for potential partners who share these concerns. And I believe that in India, particularly under Prime Minister Modi, it will see a potential ally. It will see a country that has, broadly speaking, shared interests and concerns. It will see a democracy it can identify with. It will see a country focused first and foremost on economic growth, as Trump is also likely to be. And it will see a country that is wanting economic partnerships that are mutually beneficial. And as I say, that clearly is an opportunity for this country. And I should add, a country that I think has tremendous opportunities. And that's the other thing I want to say about the last few years I spent traveling the world, and that is that there is really nowhere in the world these days where you get more consistent positive reports than this country. And just about everywhere I go in the world, there are significant concerns about major economic and strategic issues. This is the one place where virtually everyone sees an ambitious population and determined leadership moving in a clear direction. And that is very much a credit to this country, and I say very much an opportunity for all of you in the future. And with that, I'll take a few questions, but thank you very much for your time and attention.
Those questions can please line up at the mics. We'll quickly take on some questions. But while the people line up, first of all, thank you for the kind words about India. In India, New Delhi especially, you were remembered as the Prime Minister who upgraded the India-Canada alliance to a strategic alliance, went ahead with nuclear cooperation agreement. So New Delhi views you as a dear, dear, dear friend. So thank you for all that. So you spoke about, in a way, let me get you back to the question on trade in this whole game. Your tenure as Prime Minister saw a huge expansion in trade agreements. I mentioned, from 5 to 51. At the same time, you've described a different kind of world here, where a transactional world, where bilateral trade agreements, trade deals, between countries become more and more important. Are you then seeing this as the end of multilateralism, multilateral institutions, multilateral trade deals? And are you seeing a situation where China now emerges as a champion of free trade?
Well, look, I think it's certainly the case that for the foreseeable future, the big multilateral trade deals are dead. I was the Prime Minister who negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership on behalf of Canada. I think it is a certainty that Mr. Trump will not proceed with that. In fairness, Mrs. Clinton of the incumbent administration said she wouldn't proceed with it either. I can't speak to whether that deal was a good or bad deal for the United States. That was not my role at the bargaining table, but I thought it was a good deal for our country. Look, Sanjoy, I would just make the following observation about trade. I think we are in the world. We went from WTO, we weren't making big progress there, so we went to sort of looking at major regional deals. That now seems to fall flat in most cases. And so now I think we are looking at a series of bilaterals, and I think Mr. Trump may well try and pursue bilaterals with some of the TPP partners. But I would just make the following observation. You may be surprised to know I'm not entirely unsympathetic to Mr. Trump's view on this. I'm not quite sure where he's going, but I'm not unsympathetic in this sense. What I share in common with Mr. Trump is that I've actually negotiated deals. There are a lot of people who are very big fans of deals, but who've never actually negotiated one. And I can tell you from having negotiated trade deals, and as you said, under my administration, Canada went from having trade deals with 5 countries to having them with 51. I know there is a difference between a good deal and a bad deal. There is such a thing. And not just there is a good deal and a bad deal, but there is also the importance of making sure that the public is brought along on these deals. I tell people that the most significant thing about the trade deals my government signed was not that we signed them, it's that every single one of them was well received by the Canadian population when we did so. I can also tell you this, that in every single case when we signed them and the various interest groups and organizations across the country came out with their position on the deal, we knew well in advance what their position was going to be. We were not guessing. We were not just negotiating the deal behind closed doors and then finding out what happens when we put it out in the public. And so I guess my message here is, we're in an era where there seems to be increasing political activity that is focused in some cases against trade, in some cases against migration. In Canada, as a conservative, I signed a record number of trade deals, and I ran the largest per capita immigration program in the world, and we did both with widespread public support. But that's not an accident. It's not because the Canadian population is just predisposed to be favorable to all of these things, maybe a little bit, but it's because we did real work to make sure we understood public concerns and our policies addressed public concerns as we move forward. And I do think in many Western countries, I think the cornerstones of our policies in the post-Cold War era, many of the cornerstones are sound, but we have become disconnected from what the public is experiencing and whether they are benefiting or not and how we can address real concerns that they do have.
Thank you. I'll allow 3 quick questions. We've got 3 people standing, 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry, I'll not be able to allow too many questions. We're running out of time. Short, brief questions. You, sir, first. Please introduce yourself and ask your question. No comments, just questions.
My name is Shailesh Pathak. I work in infrastructure and cities. 9 years ago, Lehman Brothers happened, and it decimated the UK and the US. It did not do anything to Canada. What did you do right? Number one. And has that affected Canada's politics since then? Because people did not get impoverished after Lehman.
Yeah. Can we take both of them? You can answer them all together.
You want me to wait?
Yeah, I'll take 1 or 2 questions. Yes, sir.
So I'm Chris Zalewski. I come from Poland, medium-sized country in Europe. For us, the principles of international order are very important. And that's why I would like to thank you for your policy in Ukraine and the crisis in Ukraine 2014. And that's my question is about, do you think that the Canadian foreign policy will follow the possible change of the US policy in Eastern Europe?
Last question.
Thank you, sir. My name is Apoorv Mishra. I'm a senior research fellow at India Foundation. My question to you is about the future of multilateralism in democracies. One of the mega trends we see in the world today is that the citizens' trust in public institutions is at its lowest in recorded history, with the result that governments, especially in democracies, are more invested in multilateralism than the citizens. So, and there is very little talk about how to sell multilateralism and the benefits of multilateralism to the electorate. So how do politicians who believe in multilateralism make the arguments with the same vigor and passion than those as politicians who argue against multilateralism? What are some of the arguments that
We've got your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to you, sir.
Okay, 3 questions. The first was on the financial
2008 financial crisis. What did you do in Canada, which was right?
First of all, I just to correct the premise a bit, Canada was definitely impacted by the financial crisis. We had a serious drop in economic activity in the 2008-2009 period, not nearly as bad as other countries, because the difference was, although we were affected by the economic crisis, it had no origin in Canada. Our financial institutions were the strongest in the world. We had a good regulatory approach and good culture in our major financial institutions. We didn't have a single major financial institution failure. And we also had, leading up to that crisis, very good government management. We had been running a significant surplus in Ottawa. We had overall low debt levels in at least the government sector in the country. We actually had fairly low debt levels in the household sector and corporate sectors as well. So we were well positioned. I think we responded quickly and effectively, but that was the big difference. We were impacted very much through our export markets. We're badly hit, but the instability did not originate within Canada, and we were able to handle it that way. So look, I think that's an argument for getting the fundamentals right. You know, making sure macroeconomic policies, regulatory policies, and other things are in good shape when times are good. Because as Warren Buffett famously said, when the tide goes out, we will see who is swimming naked. On the, what was the second question?
Ukraine.
Oh, Ukraine. Look, I can't, I don't really, I've kind of made it my habit since 2015 not to really comment on the current government of Canada. I'll leave it to them to make their own case. I would just point out that, while it does seem very clear that the positions of both the new U.S. administrations and some European countries are moving away from support for Ukraine, I would just point out that in Canada, support for Ukraine is virtually unanimous in the Canadian population. In fact, I think there was actually a vote at one point on the issue, condemnation of Russia, that was, in fact, unanimous. Ukrainian Canadians are a huge part of the Canadian population and very well known and well connected in all aspects of Canadian society, and there is in Canada virtually no sympathy for the Russian perspective on that particular conflict. So I would hope that it won't change, and I suspect it won't. Final.
The third question was actually, you really addressed it, but put it briefly, it is, should leaders be doing anything to address this questioning of multilateralism?
Yeah.
Within the populations.
Look, I just go back to what I said about trade more broadly. I do think that in the West, most of our people, including people we label as populists and nationalists, most people understand that we are in a global world and that things in the rest of the world affect them. And I don't think that they inherently resist the idea that we have to work cooperatively across borders. I think where the concerns arise is when governments or leaders give the impression that they are working for multilateralism maybe as an end in itself rather than as an extension of the interests of their own populations. I talked about trade, the importance of not just theoretically freeing, reducing tariffs and eliminating borders, but actually understanding when you make those kinds of changes, what kind of impacts they will actually have on the population, how people will benefit, and if they will be hurt, how they will adjust. And in too many countries, that kind of work just has not been done. Migration, similarly. I actually, now, you know, as I say, I ran the biggest per capita immigration program in the world. But I do believe in many countries where we're told that movements are anti-immigrant, I actually have real doubts about that. My suspicion is not that the populations are anti-immigrant, it's that they think their concerns are not being taken into account. And I can tell you, you know, to go back to Mr. Trump and the debate in the United States, I can tell you that certainly in my dealings with Americans who have these concerns, concern is principally around the fact that the bulk of immigration is illegal. You know, in Canada, I've warned other leaders about this. Other leaders have said to me, in Canada, you run a huge immigration program and it's popular. How do you do it? Well, one thing I tell them is the first and most important thing is we have a legal immigration system, and ultimately, we, as the Government of Canada, we say to the Canadian population, we make our own decisions on migration. If people were simply walking into the country by the millions, I can assure you there would not be support for immigration in Canada under those circumstances. And so, you know, those kinds of concerns have to be dealt with. And as I say, it's the same thing in any relationship. The question isn't for me to come to India as Prime Minister in Canada and say, look, this is a great relationship. It's important that I be able to demonstrate that the Canadian population, it's a beneficial relationship. So I think in all of these things, we always have to remember as leaders who are involved in multilateral, transnational discussions in complicated world, none of that changes the fact that we are accountable to ordinary people and to explaining to them how what we are doing is impacting and improving their lives. And if we fail to do that, we run into problems on these other issues.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure having you at the Raisina Dialogue, and a greater pleasure, welcoming you this time to India and hoping you are back again and again to be with us. Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.